Good morning. This is Gogo, Mongolia. I'm here with Mr. Ed Jager, Ambassador of Canada to Mongolia. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. And would you like to introduce yourself to our audiences and tell us a little bit about your background?
Certainly. I have been ambassador here in Mongolia for a little over a year. I arrived in February of last year. It has been a fascinating experience, in large part because it is something that I have never done before. I have never been an ambassador. I have been a member of the Canadian Foreign Service now for about 16 years. I've had the privilege of representing Canada in different roles in places like Indonesia, Peru, Afghanistan, Brazil. But here in Mongolia is the first time as ambassador. This is a wonderful career that I'm in currently, but it's not my first one. Prior to joining the Canadian Foreign Service, in my late 30s, I was practicing law in Canada. I was a litigation lawyer in a town called London, Ontario, for a number of years. But I had even joined the practice of law a little bit later than most people. I had immediately after high school, I had gone into a number of different jobs, and I was actually in sales for a while before I decided that I needed to go back to university and get a proper degree. And so I've had the joy of three interesting different stages in my career, but certainly the most recent one, and the one that's still ongoing, has been the richest in terms of the experiences that I've had, the places that I've been able to go to, the people I've been able to meet, the things that I've been able to do.
I think there was a true calling, and it affected your whole life for the rest of your life.
You might say that. In some curious way, you could say there's a theme going through all three of my careers, in that in each one you're representing somebody or something. When you're selling a product, you're representing your company. When you're a lawyer, you're representing your client. And now as an ambassador, I'm representing my country. And I think that every step that I took along that way, I took on a greater and more serious responsibility, and it's somewhat intimidating to sit here and think that that my role is to represent an entire country to another entire country, but it's also an amazing honor and privilege, and it's every day is different, every day is interesting, and every day is fascinating.
So, what are your thoughts about Mongolia?
Well, Mongolia is just an amazing place. I have to admit that I knew very little about Mongolia when I came here in February of last year. Yes, I had done a little bit of reading in the months before, but Mongolia was not a place that I had spent a lot of time thinking about prior to the possibility of this appointment coming up about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. And so when I came here and realized that all my preconceptions were inadequate, or if not inaccurate, that I really sort of began to have my eyes opened about how interesting a place it is. Mongolia is a small place in terms of population. It's a reasonably large place in terms of land mass, but it's on the other side of the world from where I grew up in Canada. And when I got here and began to understand how beautiful the countryside is, how different it is from Canada, as well as how similar it is in some ways, when I began to realize how developed and modern a city Ulaanbaatar has become in the last decade or so, And most of all, when I began to meet Mongolians and understand who Mongolians are and how Mongolians are quite different from your neighbors. You definitely aren't. I mean, in Canada, we have a lot of experience with people from China and from Japan and from Korea. We have large numbers of expat populations that have their origins in those countries. But we have very small numbers of Mongolians, and so we don't know Mongolians very well. And so the mistake a lot of people make when they live on the other side of the world from Asia is to assume that Asia is a homogeneous sort of place.
Some kind of stereotyping.
Exactly, and although that's not accurate, it's also not. It's understandable. That sort of thing happens. I'm sure Mongolians have a certain stereotype about North Americans, regardless of whether they come north or south of the 49th parallel. And those are natural human reactions. And so it's only when you come to a country like Mongolia that you begin to realize that it has its own special character and the people have their own special character. And I've been delighted by the friendships that I've been able to form in the last year, the understanding I've been able to get of Mongolia and its people. And at the same time, I'm fully aware of the fact that in 15 months or whatever I have been here, I have only scratched the surface. That it would take a lifetime to fully understand. And when I meet people like the Canadian farmer Jeremy, who lives up in Bulgan, who's been here for 18 years, that I realize how rich his experience is. When he's able to live here for that length of time. My stay won't be that long.
Yeah.
I'm in a career where I get moved around frequently, and unfortunately sometimes that means that just when you start to have a sense of what's going on, you move on to another place.
Yes. You have been in Mongolia a little over a year now. How are you adjusting to Mongolian lifestyle?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, the Mongolian lifestyle is not that much different than my lifestyle elsewhere. It's possible for me to live a life here in UB, which is fairly similar to what I would live in Canada. I get up in the morning, I go to work, I go home at night. You know, those are the rhythms of daily life are relatively the same here as they are in Canada or in any other place. What's different here, of course, is the weather is a little bit differently challenging. The pollution, the traffics are annoyances that I don't have to face in the same way in Canada. But what's really lovely to adjust to is the fact that you can, as I did this morning, get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, take a 10-minute ride in the car, and be out in the countryside climbing a mountain. That's something I can't do very easily in most other cities that I've ever lived in. And so I think when you ask, how am I adjusting? I would say, I'm adjusting well. This is a lovely and easy place to adjust to.
Did you get a chance to explore the rural or the urban areas of your interest?
Well, I have been outside in the countryside a little bit in Mongolia. My goal is, before I leave, to try to hit every province of Mongolia, and I'm a long ways away from that yet. But I have been out into the countryside. I have driven 400 kilometers west of Ulaanbaatar myself last summer a few times, and I have been out into the Trelj area several times, and Kathy and I have done some horseback riding out in the countryside, and we've done some hiking and stayed out there. So certainly had a chance to see a little bit of Mongolia. I have been to the north as far as, well, pretty close to the Russian border, near in Selenge. I have been in the south into the Gobi Desert. But I haven't been all the way west yet. I would very much like to see the west, and I've seen very little east of UB at this point. And so one of my dreams and I don't know if I'm going to be able to fit it in this year, but one of my dreams is simply to get into my car with my wife and a sat phone and to drive west as far as we can get, and hopefully catch a lot of the provinces along the way. I would love to visit Olgi by car.
As a Foreign Service officer, as an ambassador, you play an important role in establishing and maintaining good relations between two countries. And what are the advantages of your role, and what are some challenges you face daily?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is to understand the country well enough to be able to provide good advice to my country, my government, citizens of my country, companies of my country, as to how to advance their interests here in Mongolia. The reality is that's my primary goal here, is to advance Canadian interests in Mongolia and to work together with Mongolia in the advancement of mutual interests. And that's always a challenge when you're in a country that is far away from home, where people don't know it very well, that is in a state of flux like Mongolia is, a state of transition. To know it well enough is the daily challenge. And so my challenge is to get out there, meet people, talk to people, find out what's going on, and be able to translate that into useful and helpful advice. But that's also the joy of the job, is that when you are able to form an understanding of what's going on, even if it is relatively superficial, it still gives you the ability to be helpful to others.
Mongolia and Canada share a number of similarities, such as climate condition, geography, and vast territories and population density. And we are neighbored by one of the superpower countries. And these similarities may serve in our relations in the future. And what are the key sectors of development that Canada is focusing mainly?
Well, as you say, we are similar in many ways. And one of that, a similarity that you haven't mentioned, is the fact that we're both rich in resources, mineral and other physical resources. And those are areas where we have most naturally come together within the private sector, for example. And it's well known, for example, that the Oyo mine began as a Canadian exploration project and a Canadian investment. Certainly in the stage where it became a growing mine under the management of Ivanhoe Mines. So that is a sector that remains very important to us. The reality is that Canada is one of the world's largest and most important sort of homes of mining expertise, mining investment, and that will continue to be the case. And so as Mongolia continues to find ways to responsibly exploit the resources that it has, Canada will be there as a partner. But there are other sectors, of course, where Canada also has interest, and that's not just on the commercial side, but also on the pure development side. On the commercial side, we'd be interested in doing more with Mongolia in the area of agriculture. The reality is that, especially when you look at parts of Canada like the province of Saskatchewan, where they also have to deal with a very short growing season. They have to deal with inadequate rains sometimes. And soil conditions not unlike the grasslands of Mongolia. There are some real benefits to further and closer collaboration between experts of both those areas. And so agriculture is an area where we would like to see more work, and where this embassy is promoting There are other sectors. Certainly we have expertise in cold weather construction and climate hardy infrastructure. And so there are opportunities there as well, and we're working in those as well. But at the same time, Canada has a real admiration for the reality of Mongolia's existence, and what I mean by that is that Mongolia is a thriving democracy in a space which doesn't have a lot of democracy in it. And so we're keen to help out where we can to ensure that Mongolian democracy continues to flourish and continues to develop and continues to strengthen. And so we're engaged in our development cooperation program in helping in a number of areas. For example, right now there are some really interesting training sessions going on involving experts that are being funded by the Canadian government, who are leading women particularly to have a better understanding of the electoral process and how to participate at a higher and more effective way. And so there has been training sessions here in UB and out in various provinces that have been not only successful but oversubscribed. I mean, people are coming in large numbers to these events. And so that's the sort of thing that we're very glad to be participating in and supporting. We also have been supporting work that relates to anti-corruption. It's very difficult to have a true democracy if the democratic process is corrupted. And the status of Mongolia on the Transparency International rankings gives some indication that there's still some work to be done here in that area as well. And so there are different sectors where Canada is offering its support and working in. Canada's a small country comparatively as well, and so we don't have limitless resources, and we'll never be the biggest player in some of these sectors, but we have some specific expertise and particular skills that we think we can share with Mongolia, and that's where we're looking.
In the past decade, Mongolia and Canada's bilateral cooperation expanded greatly, and we witnessed those remarkable growth. And Mongolia sees Canada as one of the important partners in North America, and the two countries are committed in developing their cooperation into the level of expanded partnership. What is your position and stance on this?
Well, I certainly think Canada and Mongolia have a strong future together as partners, and I'm never entirely clear what the terminology means, but put the terminology aside, I think that there is room for a greater and stronger opportunities for Canada and Mongolia to work together. There are clearly more opportunities to work together on a commercial basis. We see growing opportunities for development cooperation. I think that we will continue to be partners in multilateral organizations. Mongolia's seat on the Human Rights Council of the UN is an important step forward. Mongolia is proving itself to be a partner in terms of trying to help some of the other nascent democracies in Asia, and this is something that we would like to work with Mongolia on a bit more. And so I think there are definitely lots of opportunities for expanded and growing cooperation between our two countries. So whether we call it an expanded partnership or use some other sort of terminology, I'm not sure of the implications of those words and what they mean. But I do know that Mongolia and Canada will continue to be good friends.
There's always room for further development and
Absolutely.
cooperation. Could you tell us about some of the progress between Mongolia and Canada's cooperation in political, economic, cultural and development sectors?
Well, certainly we've made a lot of progress in the last couple of years. I think, especially if you look at the fact that, even a year or so ago, we had a much smaller cooperation program. Today we have, I think we're now looking at about 7 projects that are underway, worth about $40 million over the next 5 years, 40 Canadian, that is, but and so that's a big step from where we were a few years ago. On the commercial side, economically, we've certainly been growing in terms of our relationship. A big piece of that, again, is the Oyo Tolgoi mine, but the underground development going ahead is a big step forward and means a lot to Canada. Canada is the single largest source of financing for the underground. You may remember that the companies put together $4.4 billion of financing for that. Well, almost about 900 million of that comes from 2 Canadian institutions, 750 from the government-owned Export Development Canada, and about 145 million from a Canadian bank, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, CIBC. And so Canada continues to play a big role in that part of Mongolia's economy, and I think will continue to grow. On the political side, we certainly have seen progress as well. We've seen progress in terms of our relationship. Just a simple indicator of that is the annual roundtable process that we engage in, where senior officials from both sides meet once a year and have a conversation about a wide range of different issues. And this was something that was started in 2004 on a semi-annual basis, and then or a biannual basis, and then it was moved to an annual basis a few years later. But unfortunately, the last time it was held was 2011, prior to last year, and so it had gone for a number of years without being able to have a round table, and for various reasons. But in October of last year, I had some senior officials come from Ottawa, and they joined us at the table at the MFA, and we had a day-long conversation about our bilateral relationship, led by Minister Jager. So yes, we've seen some progress. We've seen some progress in a number of important different areas, and I think that relates to what we've been saying earlier. There still is potential for growth in our relationship, but our relationship is strong, and I think it will continue to grow.
In 2014, Mongolia was confirmed as the country of focus for the government of Canada for the development efforts. Could you please elaborate more on this to the audience?
What that simply means is that we have a certain part of our official development assistance, which is, I'm not sure of the exact percentage, it's either 85 or 80, somewhere in that range, that has to be, by law, devoted to those countries which we have declared to be our countries of focus. And so what it does is it ensures that our development assistance is aimed at those countries that we have a relationship with, where we think there is A, need, and B, capacity to absorb the assistance. And so we have listed originally 20, now 25 countries around the world where we feel the relationship is strong, the similarities or the coherence between Canada and that country makes sense, where there is a need for assistance, but also a capacity to absorb assistance. And those countries, that they make up that list of countries of focus. And so when we decided to review our countries of focus list several years ago, and came up with the result that had Mongolia on that list, that means simply that we will be able to devote more time and energy and more of our ODA, our official development assistance budget, to Mongolia. And what it simply has meant is that from 3 years ago to today, we have at least quintupled our development budget in Mongolia, and it may continue growing.
What are some of the most top priority projects that is being implemented in Mongolia, and in what areas they will affect?
Well, the two specific areas that we are concentrating most of our work in are broadly known as sustainable economic growth and advancing democracy. And so we have projects under the broad rubric of a sustainable economic growth that work with, for example, extractive sector management and regulation. It's clear that one of the single biggest levers of the Mongolian economy is the ability of Mongolia to safely, responsibly, and profitably exploit its mineral sector. And Canada has a lot of expertise in that, Canada has a lot of experience in that, and we're offering assistance to the Ministry of Mining, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, relevant ministries like that, with respect to how to manage the system. And that is important because without that sector producing properly, sustainable economic growth will be very difficult to create in Mongolia. So that's the sort of work that we're doing there. We also have some projects relating to agriculture, perhaps even a little bit of relating to construction, that are working with individuals, they're working with people in the fiber sector, working with cooperatives, and these are all intended to sustain, to create a possibility for sustainable economic growth. On the other side, advancing democracy, as I've talked about earlier, is also very important. We've talked about the training that we're doing in the area of women's participation in the electoral process. We've talked a little bit about the anti-corruption work. Those are all things that need to be there in order to advance democracy. We're looking at possibilities of doing more work in the area of civil service reform. So those are the areas where Canada is concentrating its efforts in these days.
In terms of sustainable economic development and business cooperation, Canada's main interest is in the mining sectors, because other sectors of Mongolia is not strong enough to engage with the businesses of Canada. How can we improve this situation?
First of all, the primary thing that has to happen is something that you and I can't fix, and that is the world's commodity market has to turn around, and that has a lot to do with not so much the production, but the oversupply or in countries like China. And so the reality is, until it becomes more profitable for countries like Canada and Mongolia to be able to sell their commodities, it's going to be tough to find the financing in the system that's necessary to develop other parts of the system. It's unfortunately, I mean, the reality is, on one side you've got a lot of people in Mongolia who would like to diversify and find new ways to create manufacturing and new ways to enliven other sectors of the economy. But unless you've got that engine that's at the heart of the Mongolian economy running, the other parts of the economy are going to continue to suffer or to struggle as well. Because the reality is that when mining is bringing significant profits to Mongolian companies, when mining is employing more Mongolians, then the economy is stronger. And then when the economy is stronger, then there's also more money to do construction, to expand agriculture, to increase manufacturing. And so the reality simply is that for the next year or so, until the commodities market starts to turn around, and no one expects it'll be quick and fast, but it'll be a slow, difficult uphill climb for the next number of years. As the commodities market turns around, then opportunities to expand in other areas will also arise. We'll do what we can in the meantime. We certainly want to make sure that we have the relationships in place, make sure people know each other, understand what the capabilities are. But if anyone wants to work here in Mongolia, regardless of what sector they're in, they have to have a long-term view. This is a country with tremendous medium to long-term potential. And I'm absolutely convinced that this is a place Canadian Canadian companies should be in, because in the medium to long term, this country will only improve. The reality, however, is if someone wants to make a buck fast, Mongolia is not the place to do it.
Canada is known for the friendly manners, hospitality, and overall good living environment. In the recent years, many young Mongolians are choosing Canada for education and travel destination. So, what are the criteria requirements from Canadian government for these people?
Well, the requirements are fairly straightforward. You need to establish your interest in coming to Canada, and you need to establish your interest in why you're coming to Canada, and you need to establish what your plan is in terms of leaving Canada. And so Canada is very open to travelers, very open to students. It welcomes the interest that Mongolians have, and would love to see more people from Mongolia in Canadian schools. If I can brag for a minute, I think Canadian schools are of excellent quality.
Yeah, one of the best in the world.
Certainly among the best in the world. If you look at the top rankings of the top 100 universities or whatever in the world, regardless of whose rankings you look at, there are always many Canadian universities in those rankings. And the result is that there are plenty of opportunities for good educations in Canada. And quite frankly, I think that if you were looking at the cost compared to some similar schools in the United States, you'd find that they're a pretty good deal cost-wise as well. And so that's got to be one of the reasons why Mongolians are attracted to Canada. Canada is a bit more geographically and climatically similar to Mongolia, as you pointed out earlier, and that's perhaps a reason why some Mongolians find Canada attractive. But it's also an interesting place. It's different than our neighbors to the south or some other countries, because it's a bilingual country. It offers the richness of both the English culture that our British founders have brought to the country, but also the French culture that those that have come from France have brought to Canada. And that combination of British, French, Aboriginal culture, into which is then injected many more different ethnic groups and interesting backgrounds, makes Canada one of the most polyglot, different and varied cosmopolitan nations in the world.
Yeah, very diverse.
You go to a city like Toronto, and I believe it's true that more than half the population of Toronto was not born in Canada. It's a fairly unusual situation in major cities in the world, that there are so many of the population comes from elsewhere. And it's true in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, you're looking at someone who wasn't born in Canada, but came as an immigrant. My parents were moved from Holland when I was a child. I was raised in Canada. I was raised in a relatively lower middle class family. We weren't, by no means were we well off. But I had the opportunities in Canada, A, to get an education, and B, to participate in public life in a way that I might never have had in many other countries in the world.
Currently, how many Canadians are living in Mongolia?
The number is always difficult to ascertain with precision. but I believe that it's less than 200 people at this point.
The sad reality is that no matter where you're living around the world, there's always a possibility of crime. And as a matter of fact, Mongolia is considered as one of the safest countries in the world. But do Canadians approach the Canadian embassy in regards to these matters?
They would if there were serious issues. I'm happy to say that we don't have too many cases of those kinds here in Mongolia. As you say, Mongolia and Ulaanbaatar are reasonably safe places to live. I have lived in far less safe countries and cities in my life in the last 15 years, and I'm happy to walk to work morning and evening every day of the year, whether it's daylight or night time, or whether it's daylight or dark. I'm out on the streets, and I feel perfectly safe doing so.
In your opinion, what are the main 3 issues of Mongolia?
Well, I mean, the biggest issue, obviously, and this is one, you're asking me this question in the middle of an election campaign, or as an election campaign is about to start officially. And so the biggest issue that Mongolia has to deal with is a certain degree of political stability. And what I mean by political stability is not necessarily that the same party always has that's not democratic. But what I do mean is that there is political stability in terms of a desire to enunciate clear positions, to hold to them, to operate from a principled view, and not just on an ad hoc day-by-day basis as to what benefits me the most. And so there is. There's not enough clarity in terms of what parties stand for, how they would run things, why they would run things, and those are the sorts of things that lead to political stability. Political instability is fostered by people whose desire is essentially to gain power at all costs. And there's probably a bit too much of that still happening in Mongolia. And so political stability is a problem Mongolia is facing. Mongolia is facing the reality of transition in an economic basis. And Mongolia has to deal with the difficulties of how do you manage an economy which is still largely based on commodities exports in a time when commodities exports are not making a lot of money. And then of course the interesting challenge that Mongolia faces is how do you ensure that the large number of young and talented people in Mongolia are able to develop and to get the education that they need and to find the jobs that they need and to be functioning and fully contributing members of Mongolian society.
As an embassy, how do you engage the host country's people? Do you organize events to give out information for those people who want to know more about Canada?
Well, we do a variety of different things, right? So it depends on what part of the our programs we're interested in profiling at a particular time. But yes, we organize events. I mean, from receptions but also we work where we can to provide information on our culture, our country, our geography, our people. We tend to do that more informally than formally, but we talk to people in schools, we work with organizations and NGOs here in town. There are a number of different ways that we can add to the profile of Canada, including this interview, of course.
Yes. I would like to leave the final moment to you, and you can add any messages that I've left out to ask you.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, but let me just say how grateful I am for my opportunity to be Canada's representative here in Mongolia. It is a fascinating place, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it is the reality of what I do on a daily basis, and I am convinced that our relationship will get better and grow over the next couple of years, and I'm just so pleased that I can make that contribution to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. This was His Excellency Ed Jager, Canada's ambassador to Mongolia. This was Gogo Mongolia. Thank you for watching.